Hey, my name's Matt Geiger, and I'm going to talk about gun control. I form my opinion based on the full story, not the Democrat story or the Republican story, and I thought that maybe there are others out there who feel the same way that I do. So I just decided to go ahead and do the research myself. My first video series is on gun rights / gun control, depending on how you want to bias the person you're talking to. But to truly understand the gun debate, I think you need to understand where we've been. And the best place to start is with the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. So the Second Amendment was passed along with the rest of the Bill of Rights in 1791, and it says that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. As I'm sure you're aware, we debate the meaning of this constantly today, but the truth is, one set interpretation just doesn't exist, because even in 1791, different people thought that the Second Amendment meant different things. Federalists like Hamilton thought the guarantee of state militias would serve the role of checking the federal government in and of itself, while Jefferson and Patrick Henry believed in a broader right to bear arms as sort of the check of last resort against government tyranny. Other anti-federalists wanted a right to bear arms for other purposes, specifically citing things like self-defense, hunting, and recreation on top of the check on federal power. The broader point I want to get across, if you take one thing away, is that the interpretation of the Second Amendment is really a nuanced issue, and it even frustrates the Supreme Court, and we'll get to that by the end of this video. So after the Second Amendment, we don't have any major federal gun legislation until the 1930s. That's the 1790s to 1930s, no major gun legislation. At that point, in the 1930s, gangsters like Al Capone and other organized criminals were causing a lot of trouble. So Franklin D. Roosevelt signed our first major piece of gun control legislation, the National Firearms Act of 1934. The law targeted machine guns and sawed-off shotguns, adding a tax, registration, and preventing the sale of those guns to felons. And one quick note, though, at that point in the 1930s, there were no background checks under the law, so the prevention of gun sales to felons was pretty much symbolic because there was no way to check if they were felons. A few years later, another National Firearms Act was passed, which required gun manufacturers, importers, and sellers to get a federal firearms license. This is the birth of the licensing requirement that plays a huge role in the background check requirements and the gun show loophole that everybody knows and loves to debate today. A year later, in 1939, the Supreme Court gave its first major ruling on gun control in United States v. Miller, pitting the Second Amendment against the sawed-off shotgun regulation. The Supreme Court ruled in that decision that the regulation was constitutional because the sawed-off shotgun wasn't a weapon that was necessary to an effective militia. So the Supreme Court took the militia stance of the Second Amendment, and they didn't really mention any other Second Amendment implications in their decision. 3 decades later, in the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson signed another major piece of gun control legislation, the Gun Control Act of 1968, as a response to a whole bunch of high-profile shootings like JFK, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and that law is what I would consider the first major piece of gun legislation we have, and it was a huge one. Most importantly, it created a list of people who couldn't own guns. That included convicted felons, drug users, mentally ill, people under the age of 21. It also expanded gun licensing requirements and record-keeping for dealers by adding things like serial number recording requirements, and it banned a lot of scarier weapons like bombs, gases, rockets, things like that. After that, our next gun control law was signed by Reagan, which was a rare compromise out of Congress to get the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986. On the gun control side, the law bans automatic weapons from that point forward. On the gun rights side, government inspections of gun dealers were reduced because of perceived abuses of federal oversight, but more importantly, the law forbid the creation of a national registry of gun ownership. And this is really important for people who are concerned about the government going around rounding up guns and gun owners, something that even today some people still worry about, despite this law. But it had further reaching repercussions, as you'll see with our next law, because a few years later we get what I would personally consider to be the most impactful gun regulation, the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993 was signed by President Clinton. Now, keep in mind, up until this point, we did have regulations banning certain people from owning guns, like the mentally ill, felons, drug users, but there was no way of checking who was included in this group. It sort of ran by the honor code, which shockingly didn't always work. Now, for the first time, background checks of gun buyers were required as a preventative measure to check for people who shouldn't be buying guns under that 1968 legislation. But there are two important caveats in that law that still matter today. Number one, under that 1986 legislation signed by Reagan, if you remember, background check records can't be preserved. So background checks are run, and then they're destroyed if the gun purchase is approved. Number two, this law doesn't apply to unlicensed private sellers not selling guns as a business. So those selling guns as a hobby or inheritance. And that's what we know today as the gun show loophole. Right after the Brady Act, Clinton signed another law, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which was a 10-year ban on the manufacture of semi-automatic assault weapons. Now keep in mind that this ban on semi-automatic assault weapons ended in 2004, wasn't renewed by Congress. So right now it's not law, and that's why it still gets hotly debated, basically anytime there's a reason for politicians to talk about guns. Now, if you can remember back 5 minutes ago to the beginning of this video, you'll recall that we've had a surprising lack of Supreme Court rulings, considering how vague the Second Amendment is and how much we debate it today. That's why the 2008 case of District of Columbia versus Heller was a hugely important decision. In the ruling, the Supreme Court strikes down a handgun ban, saying that Americans have a right under the Second Amendment to possess firearms for traditionally lawful purposes like their own self-defense. Pretty much up until this point, the Supreme Court had mainly focused on the interaction between guns and militia service, just sort of ignoring any other reference, and that's why this decision was so big. And that brings us to the present. Now, there are a couple key takeaways, in my opinion, from this history. Number one is that interpreting the Second Amendment has always been contentious. It's not just a recent phenomenon. And when I say always, I literally mean from the beginning of the Bill of Rights to the present. Second takeaway, gun control always seems to move forward in response to specific, tangible events in history. Laws respond seemingly only to gangsters, political shootings, or other shootings that get lots of media coverage. I personally worry that by focusing on only the high-profile incidences, on one hand, we could pass laws hastily and emotionally that don't really achieve certain objectives. On the other extreme, we don't respond to the lives that are lost on a daily basis all over the country as the media loses interest in the lower-profile shootings that desperately deserve our attention. Thanks for watching.